Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad, Tehami. The United States of America and China have entered a new controversy, a balloon controversy, a balloon that entered into the U.S. airspace on 28th of January. That was later on shot down by the U.S. and fell into the U.S. territorial waters. Now, China has maintained that this particular balloon was the meteorological balloon and it veered off its track accidentally because of the bad weather. The U.S., however, has accused it of being a spy or surveillance balloon which was flying over Montana to get the sensitive information. China says the U.S. action of downing this balloon is an overreaction, and China firmly opposes and strongly protests against this. Now, President Joe Biden at the same time has come under heavy criticism regarding his approach towards this balloon episode. When we talk about the Chinese senior diplomat, Mr. Wang Yi, he has said, let me quote, that the US and China need to stay focused, communicate in a timely manner, and avoid misjudgment and manage differences. Now, according to some reports from the Western media, an unannounced visit by the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been cancelled over this balloon controversy, which Chinese Foreign Ministry in a statement said it was, of course, unannounced, and we respect this particular announcement by the United States of America. Now, in today's program, we'll try to understand the future trajectory of the relationship between China and the US. And after this balloon controversy, is it going to strain the already tense relationship between the US and China? And at this point in time, at this point in history, amid uncertainty and a trust deficit between China and the US, what needs to be done and what is the way forward? We'll try to look into these questions and try to find out the answers. We are honored to have been joined in the studio by Mr. Air Marshal retired Farhat Hussain Khan. He's President, Center for Aerospace and Security Studies. Mr. Farhat, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on Views on News. We really appreciate that. And at the same time on Skype, we are being joined by Mr. Sami. Hamdi is MD, the International Interest, and also the Expert in International Relations. Mr. Hamdi, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on Views on News tonight. Really appreciate that. Now, let me begin the discussion with you, Mr. Farhat. How do you see the situation unfolding between the US and China, especially after this balloon controversy?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much, Jawad Sahab. Actually, the controversy between US and China comes out of their strained relationship that they have in various fields. Because of the famous terminology that we these days call the US-China competition. That keeps them at watch against each other in various domains, particularly in the field of technology and economy. As China is moving forward on fast on the economic front and likely to overshoot in a couple of years, and in the technology also. So therefore, the US for the last about 11 years, 10 to 11 years, through a strategy called the Indo-Pacific strategy, is wanting to checkmate China in all fields. That's the basis, and they have not hidden it. It is a documented strategy where the objective is to checkmate China. So it's a Cold War, that the second Cold War. That's what that has to be kept in mind when we talk of anything about China and India. So come to this balloon. Balloons are there, the US also uses and are using, they own it this time. They have this time owned it. Like they are doing spying on China, but they say we stay in our international corridors. So Chinese have gone a little ahead. So in my view, the Chinese may have tested the air defenses or defenses of the US.
That's what your view is about this particular balloon. But the Chinese officials have been maintaining that it was a meteorological balloon which was there at 60,000 feet. Perhaps it was flying at that particular very high altitude, but it was not meant for surveillance.
Yes, Chinese have a view and a strong view that it was not a military use balloon or a reconnaissance use balloon. It was basically a weather balloon. And balloons, of course, have various functions. The Chinese have a point. Chinese are trying to convince the United States that there is no need to react hastily on this subject, and there is a need to sit down and talk about it. That is one. But as you know, since their relationship is
strained already.
Strained already.
Right.
So it is not likely to cool down soon, but it is not expected to blow up out of proportion also.
Right.
They will have a diplomatic stance going on from both sides, heated debates, and like the visit, the unannounced visit that you said is called off. So such things will continue to happen. They will continue to show postures, but I don't think they'll go beyond that, because they are after all superpowers, and anything that they do beyond a certain measure affects the whole world. It
Right.
affects the economy of the world. Even this has reportedly affected the Chinese yuan versus dollar, even this incident. So therefore, I hope both the superpowers stay under strain, but controlled conditions, and do not escalate further in terms of military terms.
Right. Let me bring in Mr. Hamdi into the discussion also. Mr. Hamdi, how do you see the situation unfolding after this particular balloon controversy between the US and China?
Thank you for having me. I think first and foremost, it highlights just how tense the relations are between China and the US, that a balloon can cause such havoc with regards to their particular relations. I think that if it was a military surveillance, and it was a very sloppy military surveillance on the part of China, I think the very public nature of what's happening suggests that perhaps this is more a tit for tat, more of a provocation, more an antagonizing between the two parties that we've seen take place over the past year, over the past 2 years, in a particularly polarized environment, given that America speaks openly about this idea of trying to contain China. America speaks openly about this idea that the next frontier or the next wrestling match is going to be with China, and China, of course, responds accordingly. So I think that when it comes to this particular balloon, I think that it's not clear what that balloon was for. It's not clear whether it was for military surveillance or not, but nevertheless it was in US airspace, which itself begs the question how it got there in the first place and what it was doing there. And I think whichever way you look at this particular issue, it doesn't look well on the part of the Chinese or the Americans. There's no way to look at this as just an innocent act on the part of both parties, whether it's China letting their balloon get there or the Americans shooting it down. And I think that it only reflects the latest escalation between these two countries that are struggling to talk to each other, that are trying to form now orbits and alliances to push against each other. We've seen Pakistan and India get caught up in this, as well as both Washington and Beijing try to woo or try to court or try to strong-arm New Delhi and Islamabad into taking sides with regards to this particular wrestling match. But the direct answer to your question is that it reflects that a talk or dialogue between these two parties is still absent. It doesn't look like any reconciliation is happening soon. And I think instead what it reflects is the hardening ties and the entrenching of the new trenches or the new borders between these two countries, insofar as the orbits are being organized and formed, and also insofar as America and Beijing's reluctance to sit down and come to some sort of a framework of cooperation with each other that would help prevent the instability that we're seeing being agitated in countries surrounding them.
Oh, Mr. Hamdi, do you think that this particular controversy and the action, which has been dubbed as overreaction by the Chinese authorities of downing this balloon, is going to close further doors to dialogue between the countries? An unannounced visit by the US Secretary of State, Mr. Antony Blinken, has been also cancelled, with Chinese officials saying it was already unannounced and we really respect whatever the US has given as a statement regarding this.
I think that the reality is that dialogue hasn't been going well even before this particular balloon incident. And I think that while we've seen from time to time, even under the Trump administration, while we saw Xi Jinping, of course, go to the US, sit with Donald Trump, while we saw these talk of bringing the two parties closer to a common perspective, at the same time, we've seen both parties go to neighboring countries, go to different orbits and try to convince capitals to stand by them against the other, as opposed to stand by them in terms of pursuing this dialogue or framework. So in other words, it's not necessary that this balloon incident takes us further away from dialogue, but rather no serious dialogue was taking place in the first place. And I think the fact that Blinken was going to go on an unannounced visit and this unannounced visit was cancelled, I think it's more about the Americans saving face here and sort of saying, look, we are happy to talk, but the Chinese are ruining it. And the Chinese are saying that we are happy happy to talk, but the Americans are ruining it. I think that now when it comes to the messaging from both countries, even though both don't want to talk, they are both insisting that it's the other party that doesn't want to talk.
Right, Mr. Farhat, your take regarding this. Do we see the doors for dialogue in the future shutting down even further after this particular controversy?
I don't think shutting off the dialogues between two big powers is the way forward for the world, and they know it. Look at the Cold War one, when the Russia and US were at war in Cold War. They continued to talk, they continued to meet, they continued to discuss. I don't think the world has the relationship has deteriorated between the two powers to the level that they will not talk. These are initial reactions by the United States, and the reaction has been strong, surely. And the Chinese have tried to play it down and trying to cool down in a peaceful manner. And while I say, like I said earlier, they accelerate their competition in the form of technological war or the economic war. But the dialogue, I don't think, yes, some delays here and there is okay.
But it's going to be more difficult in the coming days.
Yeah,
no?
things are already difficult. Like I said earlier, there are alliances being formed in the region. US, after getting it started off in Obama's time when they announced the Indo-Pacific strategy. After, when they thought they got relief from Cold War, they have started working on it. They are starting, they have made agreements, Quad 2, AUKUS, all these agreements are basically in the same direction. So they're actively doing all these things. But what I'm saying is superpowers have to behave in a little more maturely than the normal two countries. So I think, yes, there are difficulties ahead for them, but not the level that they will not talk. They will talk after some time because they can't afford to not to talk to each other.
So, Mr. Farhat, when we talk about the Trump administration, we saw quite a clear confrontational approach from the Trump administration towards China, especially after the pandemic also, and the kind of remarks and the statements which were coming from Mr. Trump himself. Wasn't there any sort of an expectation after the change of the administration, especially under the Democrats, there could be a change in the policy, a little softer tone towards China?
Yes, actually, Trump was a little different president than the rest. And Biden, who served earlier as vice president, was expected to be a little more softer. But I don't think he has been so far. And look at Ukraine war, look at this China. So I think they're a little aggressive because their stated national interests in the region are strong. They need to maintain their, as they say, hegemonic position in the region. They need to control the seas. They need to control the air. They need to control the trade. They say it should happen under our control. So when they do that, it is aggressive. And China is coming up well in the area that I talked, economy and technologies. So they are coming up, but route is a little strained, and it is likely to go forward like this. It's not going to finish in the next 4 or 5 years or so. Because it's a Cold War that has started. Ukraine, look at the Ukraine war. It is continuing for such a long because there are two superpowers involved. This war is also on, and it will, like the other speaker was saying, it will have implications for the region if they go anything beyond this. So we will have, India is already part of the 3 alliances of the United States in the region, AUKUS, Quad 1, Quad 2 in the Middle East. Imagine, Quad 1 is, and Quad 2, India is in both. So being a big country, they have trying to have influence to checkmate China. And in Pakistan, of course, why do we oppose CPAC? It's because of the same reason. They don't want Chinese relationship with Pakistan should be warm. So they want everything under their control, which is not happening. So this Cold War would continue.
So very comprehensively and pertinently you have explained it. Do we understand now the US, whether they be Republicans or the Democrats, consider China more of a competitor, not only a competitor, but an adversary?
No, they now, it used to be initially, you see the terminology has been varying. A few years back, all diplomats started calling it, downplaying the whole thing by calling it US-China competition, right? Now they're calling China the biggest threat. So the implications are where? Geopolitics, geostrategy, and geoeconomy. And all these three important domains are being affected by their this tussle that they have. So US now is calling China a threat.
Mr. Hamdi, your take regarding this. Now, after the change of administration in the US, of course, there was a clear-cut confrontational approach by the then President, Mr. Trump. There was an expectation there could be a kind of a softer engagement when it comes to the Democrats. But do you think there was a change, a shift in the policy when it comes to the Democrats, or was it more confrontational in different ways from that of Mr. Trump?
I think this is easily explained if you imagine yourself or put yourself in the shoes of Biden. Imagine that you've come to power, and let's suppose, for argument's sake, that Biden wanted to pursue a more conciliatory approach with China. When you're sitting and you're talking to, for example, the UAE's Mohammed bin Zayed, who's upset with you, and the UAE says, I'm going to get closer to China because I don't like the way you're treating me. And Saudi Arabia says, I'm going to bring Xi Jinping because I'm not happy with you, I'm going to get closer to China. And Pakistan says that my relationship with China now, because I don't like the way our relationship has been with you. And India says, I'm not compromising my relationship with Russia, I want to stay up because I don't trust you and I don't have a good relationship with you. When you see Algeria refuses to essentially take sides on the issue of Ukraine because it doesn't want to upset Russia, and it wants good ties with China, all in order to push back against the US. If you're Biden, you're seeing that all of your allies are essentially turning towards Beijing because they're not happy with you, and the more they're not happy with you, the more they're going towards Beijing. In other words, you're seeing your allies now turning your back on you and starting to look towards Beijing as a sort of leverage against your policies or against your demands or against this global order that you insisted on upholding, in which the US is the hegemon power. And I think it's in this context that China went from being competition or economic competition to being a threat to the US. The idea being that the stronger China gets, the more these countries start developing closer ties with China. It's coming at the expense of the US. And I think it was well put by a prominent UAE commentator considered close to the government in the UAE, Abdul Khaliq Abdullah, who tweeted 6 months back that he said, we in the UAE, when we were given the choice between American F-15s or Chinese 5G, we chose Chinese 5G because the future is in the East. It was a clear rebuke towards Washington that we in the UAE are revising our policy, revising how we're going to move forward. And I think this is where the problem lies for Washington. It's not about Chinese economic competition in and of itself. It's this idea that the world is now talking about a global order in which America is no longer the hegemon, and that there are other powers that they can use to push back against the US, and they're pushing back against the US successfully. Remember when Biden sent a high-level delegation to Abu Dhabi to say sorry and to try to re-establish ties, when Biden went to Saudi Arabia to try to shake hands with the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman after trying to call him a pariah, he did that because Washington is aware that we are pushing these allies away and they have other options. And it's the fact that China presents an option that is upsetting Washington first and foremost. And this is why Biden, if he came to power with a conciliatory approach, he soon realized that the conciliatory approach doesn't work with China, because the problem is not China. The problem is US policy that has upset everybody and is pushing everybody to go towards China. And I think the US has no idea how to deal with that specifically. And that's why we're seeing other countries pay the price for it. Ukraine paying the price for US-Russia wrestling. We're seeing Philippines get caught up between China and the US. We're seeing the Middle East now getting caught up between China and the US. We've seen Pakistan get caught up between China and the US. All these countries are now going to be the ones that pay the price, because the US is unsure what to do about these countries' unhappiness with US policy and their desire to push back against the US. The US is saying, we won't let you push back against us. We will tackle China. We will wrestle with China and make sure that you guys have only the US as an option. That's Biden's problem.
Right, Mr. Hamdi, your point is well taken. We are honored to have been joined by another participant, Mr. Masood Khalid, former ambassador to China, on the phone line. Mr. Khalid, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. How do you see this situation unfolding, especially after the balloon controversy that was shot down by the US, which China maintains it was a weather balloon?
Yes, no, thank you very much. Well, I think we all know that now this China-US competition or rivalry is out in the open. No? And if you trace back, then I think it goes, it started from President Obama's time and then increased during President Trump's presidency and has kept more or less the same pace under President Biden. Or I would say it has even become more fierce in recent months. Now the main question is whether it will go for a 6 or will it be contained? Of course, there are risks in the sharpened rivalry and competition which is taking place now. There are potential theaters where a conflict can break out, Taiwan issue, South China Sea, these rival claims. So I think the situation is inherent with risks. Now this latest incident of a balloon, which China calls it was a weather balloon, and it straight into the U.S. territory and was shot down. China said that the Americans, we were keeping the American side fully informed and urged them to manage the situation professionally. That did not happen, and U.S. decided to shoot it down. And
Mr. Masood Khalid, beg your pardon for the interruption. Do you think, because if China claims that they have been keeping the US authorities on this particular balloon informed continuously, but it wasn't handled professionally when it comes to the US side, but it took quite a couple of days for the US administration to decide and bring that balloon down. Was it because of the backlash to the approach towards the Biden administration from the opponents, especially the Republicans?
No, I have seen reports that the Republicans are moving a resolution against President Biden for delay in the action. But these kind of balloons have been hovering over the sky. This is not the first incident of that sort. So, and the Chinese said that the American administration, American side had overreacted. Now, whatever may be the merits of the case, I think as a result, Secretary of State Blinken postponed his visit to Beijing. And I've also read an account, I think, in the media today, that the U.S. side was in touch with China at the highest level and told them that, if this balloon is not managed, then U.S. will take action, which they did. But I as a layman, I don't know how Chinese could control that balloon which had gone astray, a weather balloon. So there are accusations and counter-accusations. The Americans say that it was a spy balloon, and the facts are before us. But I think it is unfortunate that the two big powers are engaged in this rivalry, which is impacting the global, geopolitics, geoeconomics, and their own economies are so closely intertwined. Global economy is dependent on them. American and Chinese economies are interdependent, and rest of the economies, poor and developing countries, especially in the post-COVID phase, it is quite an ominous sign that both these countries are not able to manage their relations, which have such a wider impact on global peace and security.
Now, Mr. Masood Khalid, an unannounced visit by the U.S. Secretary of State, Mr. Antony Blinken, has been cancelled after this balloon controversy. Where do you see diplomacy and dialogue between these two superpowers heading in the coming days?
Well, I think if you ask my opinion, I think the visit should not have been cancelled because it was decided during the G20 summit between President Biden and President Xi Jinping that they will sort of move ahead and, communicate with each other. And it was a consequence of that summit meeting between the two leaders that Secretary of State Blinken was to visit Beijing. So that would have been a good sign. At least it would have, somehow softened the atmosphere. But that did not happen. And now, on the other hand, a new irritant has cropped up in the relationship. So, as I said, China, for example, feels being encircled by this emerging anti-China coalition led by the USA, and which is manifest in different regions and areas of the world, in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific. So, I mean, there are genuine grounds, or maybe on both sides, but I think it is the wisdom demands that both these powers they sit together, and I think the Chinese have repeatedly said that they want to cooperate, they want to coexist, they want to collaborate, and if there are any differences, they are prepared to negotiate. I think this is a very good position and a sound proposition, and we can only hope that better sense will prevail and things will not spiral out of control.
Right, Mr. Masood, Khalid, now when we talk about both the sides, there is a statement by the Chinese senior diplomat, Mr. Wang Yi, has said that the US and China need to stay focused, communicate in a timely manner, avoid misjudgment, and manage differences. On the other side, we see there was an earlier visit, as you have already mentioned, the Taiwan issue also. There was a visit by the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Now, the incumbent, Mr. Kevin McCarthy, he has also given clues that he might be visiting Taiwan also. Now we understand that US and China had been dealing with this particular issue, where we have China's clear policy, a bedrock policy of one China principle. Now, when such sort of a statement coming from the Chinese top diplomat, Mr. Wang Yi, and on the other side we see such type of visits happening, where does the fault lie? Where the provocation is actually happening? What do you analyze about that?
Yes, you are right, because I also mentioned that the Chinese have been saying all along, to manage their relations peacefully through negotiations, and Mr. Wang Yi also reiterated that position, which is a good position, and which makes perfect sense to me. On the other hand, the U.S. side has taken successive provocative action, including sanctions on Chinese companies, and the visit of Nancy Pelosi, and now other visits, and this cancellation of Mr. Blinken's visit. So, I mean, all these, steps have created a perception that the USA wants to, follow an aggressive policy, an aggressive approach towards China. Do everything to contain, China's growth, China's economy, which is also, affected by COVID, where there is worldwide stagflation that way. So,
and do you think it serves positively to the U.S.?
Of course not. It does not serve positively to either side. Peace and stability. When the peace and stability of the world hinges on the relationship between U.S. and China, how can it be, it can serve positive purpose? It can be a positive sign for global security. And we are just recovering actually from the COVID thing. And then this climate change is such a looming threat for the global community, for international community. And instead of focusing on these challenges faced by the humanity, time is being wasted on this zero-sum game and, bloc politics, this and that, which is very unfortunate. And I think in the U.S. also there is a very strong lobby, which is anti-China. And I mean, this is very clear from the resolution which is being tabled by the Republicans in the Congress against President Biden. So, U.S. administration is also under pressure domestically. So we should keep that in mind.
So the one last quick question, Mr. Masood, Khalid, what happened to be the options at the hands of the Chinese authorities in these circumstances?
Well, I think Chinese will be circumspect. They will be careful. They do not want to, this is my perception at least, this is my understanding. The Chinese would not like to react or respond, in a manner which further jeopardizes or which further impacts, this relationship. They will be careful and they will keep their core interest in mind. They do not want any kind of conflagration, or confrontation, military confrontation or physical confrontation. Chinese want to focus on their economic development and, they have certain national goals to achieve. And so, but their perception is that all their efforts towards national rejuvenation targets are being, constricted by an anti-China coalition. So I think we are seeing a very difficult time in global politics. And this can be very ominous, and I think we need to be careful that this does not get out of control, because as I said, Taiwan is a red line for China, and American and Chinese governments have accepted bilaterally. U.S. has accepted in 1972 joint communique between United States and China that Taiwan is a part of China. So going back on that commitment, on that undertaking, and doing provocative actions perceived by China is hardly helpful. And that's a bedrock, actually. Chinese call it a bedrock of U.S.-China relations, this Taiwan thing. So that's a potential flashpoint.
Right, Mr. Masood Khalid, former ambassador to China, thank you very much for joining on the phone line at Views on News. We really appreciate that. Mr. Farhat, now the statement by Mr. Wang Yi that both China and the US should engage, remain focused and avoid the misjudgments. On the other side, we see an upcoming visit, the clue of which has been given by the new House Speaker, Mr. Kevin McCarthy, where how this particular situation, when it comes to the Taiwan question, how should the US ideally handle this particular thing, and what are the options at the hands of the Chinese authorities?
Okay, I'll once again refer to and I'll support what the ambassador was saying. If we look at last 10 years of relationship of the two powers, US has taken a number of steps which are aggressive. In diplomacy, in a military form. Chinese have always talked of peaceful approach to various things. I'll mention a few things out of this. China, sometimes back, China so far has not gone into any of the military pact with any country, despite all this happening. US in these 10 years has formed 3 military alliances, one. Secondly, if you look at the Pelosi visit, despite the Chinese red line, they pursued with that visit. They should not have, after having accepted Taiwan as part of China, they should not have gotten that offensive. They got into that offensive. Chinese, on the other hand, have been, they proposed this BRI. When they proposed BRI, they came up with their own plan. So they've been trying to counter everything. And despite that, China has not gone into any military alliance. They haven't gone into military show of force.
That
so
pretty
far.
much owes to the China's policy of non-interference.
Peaceful coexistence. There are five
principles
of coexistence is what they are reiterating. When Obama announced this Indo-Pacific strategy, President Xi responded with 5 principles of coexistence. Let's work together for the world peace. Let's decide things in a multilateral fashion rather than unilateral fashion. So all these 5 things they talked up. But the US, for the fear of losing dominance on the world, for the fear of losing control over the region, is continuing with the aggressive steps that they fear that, that is why I mentioned earlier, they're keeping Russia busy on the other side so that they don't get together on when you come. So all these things give me an indications to give conclusion that the US is aggressive in its approach because of its military might. Chinese are not aggressive, they want to move peacefully with the US. However, this tussle that is there, this rivalry that is there, is likely to affect not only US-China relationship, is also going to affect the world, and more so the regional players that we see, Pakistan, India and all.
Don't you think there could be a realization among the ranks of the US officials also, or do you think this sort of a sense runs through the entire spectrum over there?
There could be difference of opinion. That's a democratic
because
country.
when we talk about Mr. Nancy Pelosi's earlier visit to Taiwan, there were reports that suggested there was discomfort at the White House also regarding that.
Yeah, absolutely. They, see, US is a democracy, and there are opinions available. But what the state wants, or if I may say, their establishment, what they have their own policies and not too much of control with the president in a lot of areas. So they have to go with the institutional decision making that is taken at the state. That decision was taken 10, 15 years, 10, 12 years back. China is an enemy. China is a threat. They are growing. They're going to take over us in economy. They're going to take over in remember the war of the technologies. So it will accelerate further. The war of technologies, war of economies. I think they will stay short of military. Chinese will stay cool, and US is likely to be aggressive. That's the decided strategy.
Right, Mr. Hamdi, what's your take? Does this aggressive policy or the confrontational approach on the part of the US authorities towards China, does it serve their purpose in the longer run?
I think it's a bit more complex than that. I think that one of the difficulties that we're having is that, okay, if the US is reacting to China's growing and China's growth and China's emergence on the global stage as one of these major superpowers, I think there is also the question that is posed legitimately in many US circles and in circles around the world, in Tokyo, in the Philippines, in Malaysia, in these other countries as well, as to what does it mean to have a global order in which China is dominant. When you look at the way China operates domestically, is this the kind of system? Are these the kind of values? Are these the kind of policies that we want to see as the example of which that we should implement in our own particular countries? And I think that for many of these countries, the answer is a resounding no. So I don't think that it's necessarily just the US that is being aggressive. I think there is a very legitimate question to be asked as to what does it mean if China does become a superpower that exerts all this influence in the region in and of itself, and whether that is truly a benefit to the people of the region or whether it's actually to their detriment. And I think that when you look at the alliances that China has made, a lot of it is alliances with regimes and not with people. A lot of it is relationship with regimes and not with the people. And I think that that's one of the things that's particularly worth noting when we're looking at US policy and the basis on which it is being aggressive, in that, yes, the US is being aggressive on China, but it's not doing it necessarily in a vacuum. And I think that there are necessary questions to be asked. This is not to suggest that US policy is any better or that US foreign policy is any better, but I do think that there is an Arabic saying, Allah yudrib al-taghi bil-taghi, that Allah destroys a tyrant with a tyrant. I think that we're looking at two systems that aren't necessarily ideal for what many in the region want. I'm talking about foreign policies, not domestic policies. And I think that the reaction, the reality of what we're seeing is not a moral of good versus evil, but rather competition in the absence of a dialogue that threatens to plunge the region into further instability. So I think that when we're looking at US aggression, if you're an American sitting in the White House, China is a threat to your influence. China is a threat to your economic power. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. If you're in China, America tends to be be cowboy. It tends to be aggressive in the way it protects its economic power. It's the price that you pay for becoming an economic power. I think we're headed towards more confrontational politics, but I don't think it will be a confrontation between China and America directly. I think it will be, as we've seen modern warfare emerge, a proxy battle between the countries in between that are now trying to align themselves with one or the other, or trying to balance between one or the other, albeit that's very difficult in a polarized world. But I do think that when we're looking about it from a holistic perspective, what is it that benefits the region? Even if these two powers come to an agreement, and this is the darker side of what we're talking about, even if these two powers come to an agreement, it will be an agreement that preserves their interest at the expense of the region. It won't be an agreement that essentially results in an environment in which everybody can thrive, because at the heart of it is not a competition over what is right or wrong. It's not a competition over justice. It's purely a competition over who has the right to maximize their use of the resources, or who has the right or the priority when it comes to their interest in the region. And those interests, as we're looking at the region today, as we're analyzing it, whether in Asia or in the Middle East or in Europe, those interests tend to be at the expense of the countries that have a relationship, not to the benefit of those countries. And I think that's why this is the dark side of the China-US war, in that they're fighting for supremacy over the countries in which they claim to be forming alliances and partnerships with, and the part of the global order that they claim to protect.
Right, Mr. Hamdi, as Mr. Farhat has already mentioned, that China has been following the 5 core principles in its foreign policy, which primarily relate to respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other countries and non-interference into the matters of the other sovereign nations also. But on the other side, as Mr. Farhat has also mentioned, that it was the US which was going into military alliances in various regions. Now, when such a situation happens, and there are certain back-to-back statements by the Chinese top officials, for example, by Mr. Wang Yi, that both China and the US should stay focused and communicate in a timely manner and try to avoid misjudgments. So on the other side, we see the visit by the US officials happening towards Taiwan. So where does the fault lie? As you already mentioned as saying that when Allah wants a tyrant to be destroyed, he chooses other tyrants. How do you justify that statement with what Mr. Farhat has said and what happens to be the core principle of China's foreign policy?
I think that if you talk to the Chinese privately, I think that there is an awareness that they cannot compete at the moment with the Americans, militarily at least, and indeed even economically. While they are growing, they don't necessarily want a full-on fight with the US. I think that the Chinese approach is more rooted in a recognition of weakness in the face of the US than it is about necessarily finding a framework of cooperation with the US. I do think that when it comes to the US's aggressive foreign policy towards China, I think it's true that the US has been provocative with regards to China in terms of its visit to Taiwan, in terms of its rhetoric on Hong Kong, in terms of the way it's been trying to pressure other countries that have tried to toe the balance between these two powers, such as Pakistan and other countries in between. I do agree that the US has been aggressive in its foreign policy, and that's a hallmark of US foreign policy. And I think that part of what is driving that on the part of the US is this awareness that if they leave China alone, China will become a power eventually that can actually match the US in terms of economic power and political reach. I think that in terms of the current escalation that we're seeing, I think it's primarily being driven by the US. It's driven by the insecurities of the US. And I think China is trying to temper that. It's trying to contain that. It's trying to say, look, I'm not ready for a full-on confrontation. I don't need this at the moment. And I think what the US is trying to do is take advantage of China's weakness before it becomes strong enough to actually resist in a very strong manner the US. I think for the US, and I think that if you're looking at it objectively, I think it's only a matter of time before China becomes a real superpower. And I think the US is saying, look, we're running out of time here. Let's take the opportunity as it's being presented to us to really contain China, rather than wait until it becomes a superpower that will eventually challenge us. Whether you believe that's a correct approach or not, it's something that I'll leave to the viewer to decide. But I think that if you're sitting in the Americas, the question that you're asking is, do I wait for China to become my equal, or do I try to contain it now and maintain my hegemony? And I think the reality is, if you're an American, I think the answer is clear which approach you'd prefer to choose.
Right, Mr. Sami Hamdi, MD, the International Interest Expert, International Relations. Thank you very much for joining at Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. And in the studio, we were joined by Mr. Air Marshal, retired Farhat Hussain Khan. He's President, Center for Aerospace and Security Studies. Thank you very much for your time, for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. We clearly can understand this bilateral relationship between the US and China has turned even more tense after this balloon controversy. But whatever the controversy arises, it happens to be the responsibility of the two major superpowers in this world to act with wisdom and try to figure out and sort out the differences through peaceful means and through dialogue. And the doors of the dialogue should never be shut. With that note, we come to the end of today's Views on News. Till the next one, take good care of yourselves.